My name is John Diggs.
Hi, John.
I'm an internal medicine physician. I practice full-time internal medicine in Massachusetts. It's about a 3-hour drive down here. And just to give you some background, just so you know where I'm coming from, you might have an idea where I'm going to. I voted for Bill Clinton. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I did some of my training in California, and I finished it in Massachusetts. I'm married. I have 3 daughters who are 24, 21, and 18. My wife is the oldest of 14 kids. I have 3 younger sisters, none of whom are married, and that's relevant in a way. And I went to Haverford College outside of Philadelphia, originally Quaker school, now very minimal traces of that. And went to medical school, University of Buffalo, graduated in 1983. Okay? So that's just to give you my background so that you have some idea of whether you should pay attention to what I say or not. And I've decided to call this talk, which I just made up in the last 15 minutes, Don't Dispense with Common Sense. Okay? And I say this as a doctor who's frequently called an expert. You know, people call me an expert because I have an MD degree and because I practice medicine. And sometimes people tend to be overly impressed by experts. And that's important for you to understand because there are a lot of experts telling you a lot of lies right now. We can talk about abortion. We can talk about whether withdrawing care is the same as killing somebody. Are they not the same? We can talk about this whole idea that homosexuality is a natural thing equal to marriage. We can talk about whether there is such thing as a transgender person. And during the course of all of this, you're going to hear a lot of information, and each of us at some level has to decide what's true and what's not true. Whether even truth exists. You know, there are experts who say that truth doesn't exist. There are experts who say that intergenerational sex, also known as pedophilia, also known as a crime, is not a crime, it should not be a crime. So when I say don't dispense with common sense, I say this because there are very highly placed people who will tell you things which your grandmother would have told you was not true. But because they have a degree and because they're in a position, you may tend to be persuaded. Now I know to a certain degree, this audience is selected. This is an audience which has discernment. But nonetheless, I feel a need to go over some of these things, not because you lack discernment, and I might even tell you everything that you already know. But part of the reason I want to tell you is because I'm trying to convince you and to encourage you to speak out even if you're not an expert. Because most of the time, if you're following the Word of God, you're going to be right.
That's right.
I need to specify. I'm not saying that God is right most of the time. God is right all the time. But what I am saying is that sometimes we don't interpret God's Word correctly.
That's right.
I mean, for centuries, the church, written large, thought that the earth was the center of the universe. Now, they thought that on their own. Nowhere in the Bible does it say the earth is the geographic center of the universe, but men interpret it that way. So there are times that we don't understand what God is saying because God doesn't tell us everything. As one theologian put it, we see through the glass dimly. It's like a piece of glass coated with Vaseline. You can't see the details, and you're not supposed to see the details. Much of prophecy never came true in the life of the prophet, but came true later. So we cannot, there's only one entity, and that's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, who is omniscient. And when we go around finding things, we don't invent them, we uncover what God has already created. Okay, so I'm calling this Don't Dispense with Common Sense. And it's going to be a hodgepodge of things. I have about 35 minutes, and I intend that hopefully we'll talk only 20 minutes, which will leave 15 minutes for questions. Now, as an internal medicine, my specialty is internal medicine, but I have to tell you, I have opinions on just about anything. Okay? And my opinions are not simply my preferences, like my preference is for chocolate ice cream, not strawberry. My opinions are based on my medical training, on my spiritual training, and my intent is to encourage you, again, to not dispense with common sense and to speak truth when it needs to be spoken. You know, the beginning of the whole, our understanding of the world in Scripture is what? The Word. In John, it says, the Word was God.
God. That's right.
And the Word was with God. And nothing was made that was made except by God. Okay? So Words are important. And one of the main ways that people deceive you is by changing the meaning of words. Okay? So, if I, for example, told you, I'm a doctor, and I'm coming at you with a knife, and you're lying on the table, and you have pain in your right lower quadrant, there's a good chance I'm going to take out your appendix because you have appendicitis. And you will not resist me. You will say, this is a good thing to do, it'll bring me health. Now, somebody doing the exact same motion when you're at the ATM has a completely different intent. So when we heard the speaker earlier today speak of how is withdrawing care any different from giving something which to intentionally end life, that should be a pretty obvious answer. And you notice he never addressed it. He just glossed over it, and a mind that's not astute will somehow say, oh yeah, those things are pretty much the same. And the really scary thing, which is I really need you to speak out, is because you have a whole generation of people who are being trained by people who talk like that, and people who think like that. And they are your children. Okay? So you're going to have generations of people who are not trained in clinical thinking, critical thinking. And they come out of the finest institutions in the country. So I want to give you an example just on the transgender idea, for example. There's a pediatrician at Duke University, top-level medical school, who actually said, identification of sex, it would be a mistake to say that sex is identified by external genitalia, internal genitalia, secondary sex characteristics. So here you have a doctor saying that this is not how you identify sex, you identify by how the person feels. A doctor at Duke University by the name of Deanna Atkins. You can look it up. So I'm just giving you that as an example. So let's talk about some basic things. Now, I've given talks for a lot of crisis pregnancy centers. I've spoken at Heartbeat, and there's something that I tell people in the pro-life movement that a lot of them don't seem to understand. Despite the fact that you may be intensely involved and understand the right to life, I'm going to tell you something that will take 5 minutes, and in that 5 minutes, I'm going to make you smarter than a Supreme Court justice. Now, some of you might say that's not too difficult, but... So here we go. Roe versus Wade. We don't know when life begins.
Ridiculous.
How many of you in this room was ever a sperm? How many of you in this room was ever an egg? Okay. So, let me ask you a question. I'm about 5'11". How many chromosomes are in each of my cells?
23 pairs.
See, this is why I give this talk to pro-life groups. The number is 46. Now, if you take somebody a lot bigger than me, Shaquille O'Neal, 7 feet tall, 350 pounds, how many chromosomes in each of his cells?
46.
Baby was operated on inside the womb. Picture on the top cover of Life magazine. How many chromosomes in that unborn baby's each of his cells? How many chromosomes? Okay. How many chromosomes in an egg?
23.
How many chromosomes in a sperm?
23.
So the fact of the matter is, nobody in this room was ever an egg.
Right.
Nobody in this room was ever a sperm.
Okay.
When did you start to exist?
46.
When the 23 from the mother merged with the 23 from the father and formed a brand new set of 46 that never existed before and will never exist again.
Right.
Okay? A couple can have 100 children, they're still not going to be the same. Even identical twins are not exactly the same. The point here is that you are a very well-informed audience, and you may have believed that life begins at conception, but you didn't really conceive of the conception. Okay? Life actually does begin at conception, and it begins at no other time. You have senators, Dianne Feinstein, speaking that a baby becomes a baby when it's a baby. You know, saying, babbling things like this. Pelosi, same type of message. We do know life begins at conception. This is not a theological argument. It's not a philosophical argument. It is a plain old ordinary scientific argument which nobody has ever contradicted. People can decide whether they want to respect that life or not, but they cannot argue that it's not life. They cannot argue that it's not human. And how do we know this? Because they know it. When the time is convenient, when they want the baby, then it's a baby. When they don't want the baby, it's not even a baby. So that's, I think it's important for you to understand that and remember that, because if you understand that idea, this will help explain a whole lot of other circumstances. And one of the main things it'll do, it'll teach you and allow you to legitimately and intellectually honestly defend the idea that there should be no exceptions. We should not say, because this child was conceived in rape, that it's not a child. We cannot say that because this child was conceived in incest, that it's not a child. This offense, when this fellow was talking so much about justice, he's not there, don't look.
We know.
That was an hour and a half ago. Says that he's interested in justice. If a woman is raped, who's the perpetrator?
The
Rapist.
The rapist. If the child is conceived, is the child a victim or a perpetrator, or none of the above? None of the above, exactly. So, since when do we punish the innocent bystander for the crimes of the perpetrator? We don't. So if you want to talk about justice, in the fullest sense of the word, there's your answer right there. So if you understand that life actually does begin at conception, this will help you deal with all other kinds of situations, including complex things which maybe people in this room have even participated in vitro fertilization. Would you ever want your child to be outside your body before it's ready to be born? If not, then in vitro fertilization should not be on your list of things to do. So, what I want to do is talk again about a bunch of different topics, and you can feel free to interrupt me at any time, and like I said, I'll try to leave time for questions so you can figure out what I know and what I don't know over the course of me talking. One of the things I wanted to talk about specifically was language. Even now, in 2018, you will very often hear people who are in favor of abortion say, a woman should have a right to her own body. You'll hear people say, I believe in reproductive freedom. And even in 2018, with 3D ultrasounds, with the ability to hear the heartbeat early on in conception, we still hear these phrases, and these people are the most unscientific people on it. Ask some simple questions. How many hearts does a woman have? One. If she's pregnant, there's hers and there's somebody else's. If a woman is bearing a baby boy, she has male DNA. Does a normal woman who's not pregnant have male DNA? No. And a pregnant woman doesn't have male DNA either. The baby does. So it's not her body. You want to talk about reproductive rights. When a woman is pregnant, she has already reproduced. So the topic of reproductive rights isn't even on the table. But you still hear this very same phraseology time and time again by people who want to support abortion because they're messing with the language. Okay. Next topic. Let's talk a little bit about euthanasia. In the old days, at most medical schools, you had to repeat the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath was simply a way of codifying the distinction between the healers and the killers. And it specifically says you won't help somebody kill themselves and you won't help somebody have an abortion. Now, this is not our God. This is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is Asclepius, a Greek god, a made-up god who can't respond to prayers anyway. But nonetheless, that's what the oath was for. So when you do that, one of the big things that was accomplished was making a difference between these two. If an OBGYN doctor does abortions, and she walks in your room, and she just finished an abortion, your baby's struggling, you have to wonder, what mode is she in right now? Is she in the healing mode, or is she in the killing mode? The fact that doctors support this is not a reassuring factor. Doctors have done all kinds of bad things. Doctors continue to do bad things. But one of the things you need to do is to have some sort of way of reckoning with it. So, the experience of assisted suicide, for example, in Scandinavia, which never came up as a topic, is that once they started doing anonymous surveys in these Scandinavian countries, most of which have socialized medicine, so they have almost an impeccable database because everybody is in it, they find out that huge numbers of doctors, over 60% who participate in it, admit to having killed patients against the patient's will. Okay? So the question was asked, we put this law in, if you don't want to participate, what difference does it make? It makes a huge difference because it changes a person's attitude. it changes the attitude of the country as a whole. It changes the attitude to the degree that people no longer recognize what's right and what's wrong. Because if it was wrong, we would prohibit it. But we don't prohibit it. They have done studies, other things that didn't come up in this discussion this afternoon rather, that shows that a very small percentage of the people who get these suicide drugs actually use them. Where are they? Where are the drugs now? They're not accounted for. So what you have is medications that have high lethality floating around the society that can be instituted at any time. You think date rape drugs are bad? One of these drugs can ruin your whole day. Okay? So that's the Scandinavian experience that hasn't been discussed. The doctors admit to killing patients against their will. Not one or two, large numbers of doctors admit to doing this. And it's something they never trained for. It's something that they never intended to do. But again, if the society doesn't put up barriers to it, it creates a sense of permissiveness. And that sense of permissiveness is real. This is not some slippery slope that you have to imagine. This has already happened. We don't have to go the route of Scandinavia to find out what's going to happen in this country. One of the things that was also spoken about very prominently was the fact that a person can control their means of death. Okay? If you can control your means of death, why do you need to be sick? I've examined a lot of people. I see about 90 or 100 people a week. I've been practicing medicine since 1984. I haven't found one single patient with an expiration date. And I look pretty closely. The fact is that we are born and we die and we don't know when. So for somebody to say that it hardly ever happens that a doctor says you have 6 months to live and it turns out to be wrong is completely false. I never had a class on how to predict how long a patient's going to live. Never. We look at somebody, we make an assessment, we make a guess, we try to give people a chance to prepare, and we always get surprised. Always. People go on hospice and they come off hospice, which means we were wrong. Sometimes we put people on hospice because they'll get better services. Not because we really think they're going to die, but because they need help in the home. And the government has now arranged that hospice gets covered almost without question. So there's a lot of things that go on that affect people's decisions. But one of the most important things, again, is to not dispense with common sense. Okay. Next thing that came up. I did a television show last night on the transgender topic. Now you may think that this is irrelevant to the topic of life, but it's not. Because I contend, and I'll talk more about this towards the end, is that this entire thing is not just political, it's not just physical, it's not an issue of patriotism to the United States. This entire thing is a spiritual battle.
Oh, yeah.
And-
Yeah, absolutely.
And this spiritual battle is against not me, not you, it's against the Creator. It is like coming out of the book of Isaiah when Satan says, I will, I will, I will. Basically, I will compete with the Most High. I will compete against God. So how do you do that? One, you create a technology where you can pretend that you are making children without a mother and father.
Yeah.
You destroy the natural family and say that the children belong to the state, not to the family. So you have obstetricians, especially when the whole infertility treatments started becoming more high-tech, who feel like God. They actually feel like they're creating life. Are they creating life?
No.
No. They're putting the parts together that God created. And even then, the life only comes about because God allows it. And that message that God is in control is the beginning of this talk, and it's the end of the talk. God is in control.
That's right.
Which means, if a woman is raped and becomes pregnant, there is somebody else that had that in mind besides the woman or besides the rapist. It means that if a woman or a child becomes pregnant through incest, the same thing was there. If you look back in Jesus' lineage, among his lineage is a prostitute. Okay? So, if God is in control, one of the biggest ways you can put an affront to God and say, I am in control, is by taking the very basics and say, I was born a man, but now I'm a woman. Why are you a woman? Because I decided so. Truth is, I hate to admit this in public, but I was actually a man trapped inside a woman's body. And then I was born. But the idea now is that you can become a woman, you can change your sex just by thinking of it. So think about this for a second. There's an XY chromosome. There's a little addendum that allows sexual differentiation. And the vast majority of people have normal sexual development and are neatly divided into male and female. There's a tiny percentage of people that have some disorder of sexual development that come out with some either confusion on our part as people looking from the outside, or even hermaphroditism or mosaics, where there's a disorder in the way things split and how the child develops. But those are a small percentage, and that's not who we're talking about. There are a number of people who are alienated from their own bodies. And this alienation, especially when other people say, hey, this is a good idea, can sometimes be perceived as, I'm trapped inside the wrong sex body. Now, there's a little bit of a metaphysical question that I want you to consider. What does it feel like to be a man? Now, on the surface, that seems like a stupid question. What does it feel like to be a woman? Women, ask yourself, what does it feel like to be a woman? You know what your truthful answer is? You don't have a clue. All you know is what it feels like to be you.
That's right.
You do not have some sort of archetypical woman inside you that tells you what it feels like to be a woman. But all the same, we're getting these messages from all over the place. You think, what do we think? Texas, conservative state. Guess who won women's 110-pound wrestling championship?
Okay.
No,
Transgender.
a guy, so a person calls himself transgender. Born a woman, supposedly making a transition to being a man, getting testosterone injections. Now, if I'm a man wrestling in Texas, and I'm taking steroids like testosterone or one of its analogs to make me bigger, faster, and stronger than my competitors, I'm cheating. This female is getting testosterone, and it's not cheating. She's won for the second time in a row. Now, the reason that came about is because Texas says you have to go with the sex that's on your birth certificate. This person is supposedly transitioning to be a male, so she's allowed to take testosterone and is forced to compete against girls. Completely unfair, and there's somehow some pride on this person's part in having accomplished this. So I think that the other big thing which completely undermines this whole idea even from a philosophical or logical point of view is this. For the last 25, 30 years, what have we been told about sexuality? If you are a man attracted to a man sexually, this is an immutable, unchangeable characteristic. Now we're being told in the transgender world that you can change your sex just because you think you're a different sex. How do you take these two things and put them together? You can't. But part of the reason I want you to speak up is because most of the people you're hanging around never think about this in congruence. They never think about the fact that these two things don't match up very well. Okay. In terms of people, there's a couple of sources I want to give you that I think you should write down because this has been very helpful to me. There's a fellow named Ryan Anderson, Ryan T. Anderson. He just released a book within the last 10 days. I haven't read the book yet, but I've heard him speak about the book enough that I think I can legitimately recommend it. It's called When Harry Became Sally. Okay? Not When Harry Met Sally, the movie. The book is called When Harry Became Sally. And I think you'll find a lot of useful information there that will allow you to have this discussion at a kitchen table level. Okay? Another source is a fellow named Jordan Peterson, who's suddenly been showing up on YouTube and television a lot. The reason I recommend him, he's a Canadian. By the way, Canada has no First Amendment right. Okay? We take this First Amendment thing as a given. A country as Western developed as Canada has no First Amendment. There are things I can say in this country that would get me arrested in Canada. Okay? And He was fighting against a law, I think it's a bill that had the letter C16 at the end, which said that you must call a person by their preferred pronoun, okay? And he's been fighting against it. He's a clinical psychologist. The reason I suggest you go look at some of the things he does because he points out some of the glaring inconsistencies and how important they are. The way he frames it is in the terms of a term called postmodernism. Sometimes people look at trends, whether you want to talk about the Renaissance period or the Enlightenment or those kinds of eras of Western development. And he calls the current time postmodernism. And one of the things that he points out about postmodernism is that it's nihilistic. It has a complete idea that you can't even, part of the reason you see speakers being shut down is because our kids, our college students are being trained in postmodernism. And their idea is that you are so far off, we shouldn't have a discussion. We should just eliminate you. And the important thing, the reason this is dangerous, is because that is the root of over 100 million murders in the 20th century committed by governments against their own people. I want to remind you of a few things. I want to remind you that Stalin killed more Russians than he killed Germans. I want to remind you that Mao Zedong killed more Chinese than he did anybody else. I want to show you the complete irony of the Khmer Rouge being trained in Marxism and socialism in France, educated in France. They go back to Cambodia, and who do they kill off? The educated people. They killed people who wore glasses, because if you're a farmer, you don't need glasses. They killed people who could read. They killed 2 or 3 million of them. And on top of that, they hardly used a gun, just to dovetail into some other current conversations. Okay? So, and these are not wars. These are governments killing their own people. And that comes out of the root of a sense of nihilism, that nothing's worthwhile, and secondly, that discussion is fruitless. And that's where a lot of our young people are headed. Berkeley, supposedly the bastion of free speech, had riots because of 2 different speakers, Mallory Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro. The police stood by and watched. Middlebury College, Vermont, a speaker came. The teacher that invited the speaker was assaulted and had to go to the hospital with a neck injury. They wouldn't even let the person speak. I've been at occasions like this, not those 2 particular ones, but I can tell you, when people get in a certain mindset, people who would not participate suddenly do participate. Why? Because they're afraid they're going to be next. Okay? So this whole idea of postmodernism deserves to be repulsed early and immediately. Okay? When you hear somebody say, well, we can agree to disagree, they're on that path. They're on that path to the point where conversation is fruitless, and then the ends justify the means. Okay? No, I wasn't prepared to speak, so I'm going to be out of order a little bit here. I want to go back to something about this whole idea of homosexuality and transgender. When people get involved in either one of these lifestyles, what do? They reflect the natural order. When you see a same-sex couple, there's one that's masculine and one that's feminine. Think about that. If there is no natural, if heterosexuality is not natural, why do people, when they go off the rails, imitate the natural? Because it is natural. Okay? And when I said before that this is a spiritual battle, if you want to read about spiritual battles in a relatively short number of scriptures, you go to Ephesians. Okay, and it says we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And what it does is it lists out an order of priority of the level of the powers. Okay? What is that? That is God's order. Satan has an order too.
That's right.
Because Satan is a great imitator. So when people get off into these other so-called alternative lifestyles, what are they doing? They're imitating the natural order. Okay? So you got this big push now where people are saying, in terms of the transgender issue, we ought to start treating these kids younger, giving them puberty blockers, giving them hormones that correspond to the other sex. Do we, as medical professionals, know what the outcome of this is going to be long term?
No.
We don't know. Okay? But to tell you how powerful this idea can be, I have a friend of mine equally trained doctor as I am, friends of mine when I lived in California. The husband is a PhD in physics, trained at Berkeley. So two very intelligent, highly trained, specifically trained, of course, in medicine for the woman. They allowed their 18-year-old daughter to have her breast cut off. She was having issues when she was 13, 14, 15. She was depressed. They unfortunately found just the right psychologist who had a transgender as his niche. So suddenly, huge numbers of his patients were identified as transgender because that was his problem. In psychological terms, we call that projection. You're taking his problem and saying, you have it, you have it, you have it. So when I say don't dispense with common sense, I think of her because she's highly educated and she still allowed this to happen to her own child. Okay? What else? I've got 8 minutes left. Is there something else I want to Breastless. Breastless, that's how she is.
Is she happy that she...
Well, the part of the point I didn't make when I was going on this, if you look, when psychologists look at children who have this sort of tomboyish behavior if you're a girl or more feminine behavior if you're a boy, 85 to 90% of them resolve it spontaneously. If you start giving them hormones, you actually put it in concrete that it's not going to change. Okay? Definitely they're not happy. Whether you look at so-called places that are more rigid, or whether you look at places which are very egalitarian and try not to put any expectations on anybody, like Scandinavia, Denmark, people who are transgender have a 40% suicide attempt rate, whether they have surgery or not. 40%. The average population suicide attempt is about 4%. So it's at least 10 times. Now, of course, same thing happened with the whole homosexual idea. The claim is made people are doing this because they're shunned by society. But when you go to non-shunning societies, you find the same numbers. So, anyway, that'll sort of wrap up what I wanted to do, and I'll be glad to take questions, but my biggest thing I'm trying to encourage you to do is not to dispense with common sense, because you've got eyes, you've got a brain, you can read. What you really need, I'm not talking to you, because but you need courage. You have to have the willingness to speak up. Think about it this way. As soon as you mop the floor in your house, it's on its way to getting dirty. Okay? This country became free as a country in 1776, and it's a unique country. If you don't know the United States is unique, you need to read some more in history. Okay? Because there are things in this country that have never happened to any place else. How many other countries conquer another country and then leave? Leave them better off than when they started the war. Okay? And how many of them actually have God in their founding documents? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That is acknowledgement of the Creator, and it's in our founding documents. But the point is, even after 1776 and getting our independence, freedom is not free. Just like you have to keep mopping your floor, you have to keep fighting for freedom. And first, we're going to...
I would like to know the name of your book.
Notebook.
Are you planning to write a book?
No, I practice medicine full time. I've thought about it a lot of times, and I've never gotten any further than that.
Please.
You will. Is there a way that you obviously, you're a very effective speaker. You have personality.
I've never turned down an engagement, so.
Yeah.
Better than the others.
Is there a way, I know you're, as a doctor, you're extremely busy, but is there a way that a film of you talking can be...
There's a few on YouTube. I've been on the O'Reilly Factor about 15 years ago. That film is still floating around.
Okay.
What is your...
So, Don Eskew knows how to reach me, if need be. Yes.
Do you really live in Massachusetts?
I'm purple. I'm red in a blue state.
That's where we are. The other side never lets a person like you survive without destroying them. How did you survive?
By the grace of God, and I mean that in every sense of the word. The fact of the matter is, I think me being black makes it a lot easier because the left always deals in identity politics, and I'm part of the protected class.
Yes.
That's the truth. That is the truth.
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question. You were talking about before about how, the homosexuals are imitating the natural order. I mean, is it true? I mean, I read someplace that they're actually trying to transport women's wombs into other bodies. What do they call that? Organ,
I can't speak knowledgeably about what's being attempted. I mean, a lot of weird things are being attempted. They're trying to mix human DNA with animal DNA, so who knows what's going on, and I can't speak knowledgeably about that. Yes.
Do you recommend groups? Do you recommend groups that can fight for more freedom, or do you know of groups or associations?
Oh, well, there's a lot of groups, and all of them have a problem. I don't belong to any of them because they all have a problem. And Heritage Foundation has tons of information. This guy Ryan Anderson, I think, is at the Heritage Foundation, for example. Family Research Council used to be a real powerhouse. They've come a lot more mute lately, for example. What else can I think of off the top of my head?
What about Hillsdale?
Hillsdale, if you're going to go to college, that's where you go if you have a choice. They don't take government money, which enables them to not have to follow certain
What
regulations.
other colleges don't pay it?
I'm a doctor, I'm not an educator, but I've certainly heard about Princeton College, which is pretty small. But to a certain degree, I think that if you can get your kids out of public school, that's great. But at some point, they have to deal with the world. So I'm not one of these person that says you need to be cloistered. I have no hesitation about my kids at Mount Holyoke, Swarthmore, and Skidmore. But I did my best to train them. But just like salvation, each of us has to get our own. Yes.
You're pretty good for a substitute, too.
Every once in a while, the pinch hitters.
You said that you worked for Bill Clinton in the 90s.
Yeah.
When did you decide to basically switch party lines? What made you think that's a good question?
Moving to Massachusetts. I grew up in Washington, D.C. At the time, it was probably 75% black area. First and second grade, I went to 90% black schools. My parents got divorced and moved to Buffalo. I went to 90% white schools. And I sort of bought the party lie that the South was racist and the North was not. So when I moved to Massachusetts, I saw racism in a different way, and I realized that leftists were liars. That's what it boils down to, really. They change the meaning of words. They hide their intent. And since then, I've been more educated by people like Dinesh D'Souza, who you can find on YouTube. And he did the book Hillary's America, which outlines how the Democratic Party formed the KKK. And then more recently, I did a presentation on what I examined personally. I looked historically at the black family in America, and I saw the black family in America, and I survived slavery, survived Jim Crow, fell apart under the Great Society, war against poverty. So those kind of things made me say, you know what, these people are wrong. There was one Sentinel event that sort of opened my eyes. There was a woman who was shot in her car. She was pregnant. Husband calls 911 and says a black man came and shot my wife. Okay? This is in Boston, and I was living in Massachusetts at the time. It turns out that the man shot his own wife, and his brother took the gun and threw it over the bridge, and it's because he had another girlfriend and the wife was in the way. So what did Massachusetts do? Massachusetts went to the black parts of Boston, hundreds of people, threw them up against the wall, frisking them, looking for this man who supposedly shot this man's wife. Very short time later, white woman in South Carolina says, black man took my car with my 2 kids in the back seat. Okay? It says that, what did South Carolina do? I think it was South Carolina. What did they do? They did standard, ordinary, everyday police work. So the racist people acted like police, and the so-called liberals in Massachusetts acted like racists. And that's what opened my eyes.
Just to keep on the theme of the physician-assisted suicide, one of the linchpins to their arguments in support of that includes the 6 months to live prognosis. Now, you just shot that down very brightly. I would imagine that no one really knows or can predict how long someone will live. I always assumed that that was a given, just granted that because of statistics. You'd say, once, the date that you're diagnosed with some disease, well, how long statistically do you live? So how does that come into play?
Okay, well, I think there's several things. I mean, one is simply that people give doctors a lot of credit for things they shouldn't give them credit for. I can't tell you how many times I'm an internal medicine doctor. Well, my neurosurgeon says such and such. What do you think? I'm not a neurosurgeon, don't ask me. So people have a tendency to give doctors credit for expertise in areas that they don't actually have. And of course, one of the things you'd think we would have is how long do people live? And the truth is we're wrong so many times it's not funny. Both ways. Sometimes people die sooner than we think, sometimes they live longer than we think. And it's because each of us is different. I can have 100 people come to me with the exact same problem and it'll present in 100 different ways. So this medicine thing is a lot more complicated than plugging a diagnostic thing into your car and finding out that your spark plug is bad.
Do you think these laws will give people permission to get rid of people? Well, we don't want people on Medicaid, so let's give them medicine and get rid of them. We don't want people who have Down syndrome, so let's get rid of them.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt what you're saying is absolutely true, and I'm really surprised that the gentleman did not at least tell the truth about what's happening in Oregon. In Oregon, they have, the way they do their Medicare is they say, we'll cover these conditions. If you have these, you're out of luck. What's always on there is assisted suicide. They never run out of money for assisted suicide. Okay? So, and the truth is that people go from having a so-called right to die to developing an obligation to die.
Because the reason why I say that, because I'm disabled, and I have to fight for, I have a brain tumor, and my medicines are not covered. But if I didn't have family members who were willing to help me pay for my medicines, I would probably shoot myself in the head because I have headaches. And they don't want to pay for my medicines. So I see how they have easily moved things in to try to get rid of certain people, especially indigent people.
Yes, I have no doubt about that, because part of the picture, if you don't believe in God, then there's nothing after death. And so you are nothing more than a highly developed other mammal, and so why are you important? Do you have a soul? No, you don't have a soul. So if that's the case, then that's why in the Soviet Union they got rid of religion. I mean, who are some of the most religious people in this country? There are people who immigrated from the Soviet Union. Because they know that God exists and they've seen what happens. Who are the people that fight hardest on some of these social issues? They're very often the Russian immigrants who say, you guys are fools if you're going to sit here and let these people do this, because the next step is you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Change this to
I
this.
just
One comment. I just want to tell you, and I want to make this decision very easy for you. Write a book, please.